March 1915. In France, Europe's armies are entrenched as the First World War grinds on. In England, the Asquith Liberal government is about to give way to a coalition. D.H. Lawrence has just completed the manuscript of his novel The Rainbow, which is later to be suppressed by the censors. On the weekend of the 6th to the 7th of March, Lawrence comes to Cambridge for the first and only time. Afterwards, he describes the visit as one of the crises of his life. He travels here at the invitation of his newly acquired friend, Bertrand Russell. The two men are to collaborate in a series of lectures on the philosophy of social reconstruction. Their program is to be anti-capitalist and a protest against the slowly intensifying war. Russell announces Lawrence as a prophet of the emotions, a champion of wild nature. He hopes his fellows will be impressed by Lawrence's ideas. But the visit is a failure. Lawrence behaves morosely. His conversation is irritable and dissenting. He scorns academics who discuss the war situation and know nothing about it. He is sickened by the marsh stagnancy and rottenness of their town. Lawrence's ambition to initiate a great and happy revolution in the state with Russell is not realized. Their social experiences are fundamentally different. The obstacles to their collaboration are cultural as well as personal. They cannot discuss social crisis in the same language. Russell's reformist assumptions are not radical and revolutionary enough for Lawrence, who rejects them. Their friendship lasts barely a year, and each faces the war alone. How can we understand this episode, drawing together as it does the conflicting threads of our social existence? We can only begin to comprehend it by looking at Lawrence in terms of the conflicts of his own time and place. Lawrence called this the country of my heart, but there are deep divisions in his heart and in his art when he portrays it. Divisions which were equally deeply embedded in the country itself. Well before 1885, an industrial urban economy was established amidst the rural landscape. The agrarian life was already dependent upon the industrial base of the coal mining which had succeeded it. The experience of historical transition and the opposition of the encroaching urban and declining rural ways of life had long been features of the history of the community into which Lawrence was born. There were some continuities between the developing mining industry and the cultivation of the land, local land and industrial entrepreneurs. But mechanization had largely occurred by 1860, and the conflicts and contradictions experienced by Lawrence's community were basically those of an advanced, urbanized working class. As one of the first artists to write from a position within this class, Lawrence offers different and frequently contradictory models of his community. Although their form and ideological function change, The natural world and the world of alienated mechanical labor are constant presences in his texts. But Lawrence's writing always returns to the problems of redefining the basic values of community, as those values emerge from the movements of a specific historical process. The process of mechanization, which accelerated during Lawrence's early life, brought with it gains and losses for the miners. It brought a relative improvement in their harsh working conditions. The butty system, under which Lawrence's father was employed, had miners work in teams, competing against each other. But even this limited sense of solidarity was ultimately fragmented by the advance of mechanization, as every member of the team was isolated underground. In fact, there was an extended period of stable labor relations. The butty system, for example, encouraged competition for the most profitable seams and appeared to represent the interests of employer and worker alike. However, this temporary balance of power between management and men coexisted with the continuous and fundamental conflicts between and within working-class families, conflicts which manifested themselves beyond the pit gates. It is these day-to-day conflicts within the political unit of the family itself that Lawrence focuses on in Sons and Lovers, but he locates them firmly within a broader process of historical transformation.
The Bottoms succeeded to Hell Row. Hell Row was a block of thatched, bulging cottages that stood by the brookside on Green Hill Lane. There lived the colliers who worked in the little gin pit 2 fields away. The brook ran under the alder trees, scarcely soiled by these small mines, whose coal was drawn to the surface by donkeys that plodded wearily in a circle round a gin. And all over the countryside were these same pits, some of which had been worked in the time of Charles II, the few colliers and the donkeys boring down like ants into the earth, making queer mounds and little black places among the cornfields and the meadows. And the cottages of these coal miners, in blocks and pairs here and there, together with odd farms and homes of the stockingers straying over the parish, formed the village of Bestwood. Then, some 60 years ago, a sudden change took place. The gin pits were elbowed aside by the large mines of the financiers.
Sons and Lovers, then, is about change. It may appear to be a novel about the formation of an artistic temperament, but it contains a tragic vision of the relations between individual and community. The power of the text is that it confronts social and economic problems as they are embodied in the most private experiences: home, family, sexuality. Gertrude Morell's desire to change and better her life through her children is pitted against the law of replacement in the industrial working classes, epitomized by her husband. This produces the central struggles of the text. But this is only because the relations of power in the Morell household reproduce and intensify the patterns of domination in society as a whole. Even the seemingly idyllic Willey Farm is a subverted pastoral, ironically introducing the same patterns of female drudgery in family existence. The conventional escape from domestic and industrial monotony is through social mobility, but this is an option the novel refuses and presents as a form of death. In Sons and Lovers, there is no middle class, and the worlds of education and art, which provided Lawrence's own escape route, are nebulous and ill-defined, not sharing the book's roots in the particularities of time and place. Sons and Lovers selectively reworks Lawrence's own history to dramatize the forces forging his identity. The text exists only through our readings and reworkings, and if we are to grasp the novel fully as a representative tragedy, we must read its processes of distortion and selection historically. We must avoid simply placing sons and lovers in the abstract realm of art, which the novel itself regards with such caution. In fact, the only political force actually presented in the text, however problematically, is the women's movement. This is seen in the suffragette Clara Dawes and in Gertrude Morell's Women's Cooperative Guild. Lawrence's mother, the model for Mrs. Morell, was an official of the Eastwood branch of the Cooperative Women's Guild. But the way in which these elements are progressively marginalized in favor of a focus on the figure of Paul Morell anticipates Lawrence's future problems in dealing with political activism. We cannot take Lawrence's portrayal of community and his relation to it as simple fact. Versions of Lawrence's early life frequently encourage us to see him in isolation from his background. The claustrophobic and divided working-class family Lawrence portrays is too frequently idealized and stereotyped in our reproduction of the text. The family is, in fact, the historical locus of personal determinations, but is often thought of as an unchanging universal institution.
It's a tragedy in the sense that a number of lives are being blocked and that there's great difficulty in them understanding why they've been blocked. On the other hand, there is, for me, the tragic sense of the ending, which is often taken as a kind of liberation. This is the first powerful introduction of what became a characteristic ending to a novel which has encountered, as Sons and Lovers does, major questions of social conflict, social growth, the pressure of work on personal lives and so on. That moment of walking away and seeing the lights, which has become almost the stereotype of liberation, of getting out from under an impossible situation. For me, that is more tragic than the situation that is being left, in the sense that to walk away from it with that much sensitivity, that much intelligence, and to feel that that is any kind of response to what is going to go on happening there. Of course, people grow up and develop and in that sense change and go away. But it's symptomatic in a way of Lawrence's encountering in the most important way in his generation what was really happening in the major parts of English industrial life, and right down from the most general questions of work to things inside the family and the most intimate relationships. And then thinking that this can be solved in terms of the development of one person, one individual. Especially if readers then add, and of course he goes away to be D.H. Lawrence, the world-famous novelist, which makes the thing not tragedy but ironic farce.
The war is the major historical transformation Lawrence lives and writes through. The intimate connection between this social crisis and his writing cannot be underestimated. Lawrence's first reaction anticipates the difficulties he will have in exploring a communal crisis within the limits of a personal art. His vision of tragedy, sexual division, and disintegration within the working class community is expanded as the foundation of a more ambitious cultural and political diagnosis. But he is pressured and pulled in different directions as he attempts to chronicle the end of a historical era. He sees the war as the inevitable culmination of the age of capitalism, mechanization, and mass organization. it will alter completely his attitudes to community, the working class, and women. Lawrence's response appears both simplistic and highly personal. His representation of the social world loses sharp definition. He begins to portray community as an undifferentiated mass. Contrary to this is an almost unbearably close focus upon the individual. The main cipher for individuation is female sexuality. But however subjective and private this reaction might seem, it can only be understood as a part of the widespread public bewilderment of the social consequences of the war. As Lawrence visits Cambridge, the faltering Liberal government announces a register of women willing to do industrial, agricultural, and clerical work. This signals the movement into new jobs which will permanently change women's social position, with the munitions crisis and the conscription crisis necessitating their mass mobilization. For a short time, Lawrence looks to women for the social transformation he desires. The aims of the Cooperative Women's Guild his mother belonged to were a peaceful revolution from autocratic capitalism to democratic cooperation. And in the early part of the war, and during his collaboration with Russell, Lawrence insists upon the role of women in his great and happy revolution. Writing to Cynthia Asquith, the Prime Minister's daughter-in-law,
It is a question for the women of the land to decide. The men will never see it. But I still have some hope of the women.
By the end of the war, however, the new role women have found through wartime labor is seen by Lawrence as a new and perverse fulfillment of the law of replacement in the industrial state he detests. Their limited gains are now a positive threat. His position is part of a reactionary shift in masculine ideology occasioned by the war. In The Rainbow, however, rewritten during the early months of the war, the heroine's struggle for emancipation is set more productively within and against historical process, with Ursula representing the most hopeful future for a society in actual collapse. But the impulse for change, initiated by the women in the book, finds no cultural realization and becomes a passionate subjectivity set against an alienated public culture. In this process, the particularized, localized history of sons and lovers begins to yield to a conflation of history and nature as vast impersonal processes. Ursula's education parallels Lawrence's own. Classroom and college again reproduce patterns of domination in the whole society, at best inducting the working class into the operation of the industrial machine. The violent rejection of contemporary culture from within the contours of a particular history disrupts the fabric of memory and common experience in the novel. Ursula's desire is thrown forward onto a transformation so total as to be conceivable only in imaginary terms, yet in terms given substance by the fabric of experience and memory the text offers. In the teeth of a felt cultural disintegration, The Rainbow opposes bourgeois morality and progressive liberal solutions, in effect refusing the kind of project envisaged by Bertrand Russell. Their collaboration will eventually be seen by Lawrence as an attempt to reconstruct the society that produced the Great War.
I think that he picked up this sense that there was a sympathetic, enlightened, educated class, although whenever he met their representatives, he immediately recoiled from them, I think rightly. He was pulled both ways. I mean, about something like the strikes and the whole notion of irreconcilable conflicts. But after all, no one more than Lawrence ever emphasized the fact of absolutely irreconcilable conflicts. I mean, he's not a man who's talking about minor adjustments and sensible compromises. He is saying it's life or death, that there are these forces driving us to destroy our lives and make them ugly. He's less certain about what the forces are which are moving in the other direction, but he knows the difference between them.
The rainbow already implicitly rejects any reformist measures, even including votes for women, as mere mechanical freedoms which consolidate the industrial machine of the nation-state. This sense of the industrial state's capacity to reproduce endlessly its own deadly order through the incorporation and destruction of individual lives finds a starker expression in the image of Gerald Creitch's newly mechanized mining industry. This image haunts the Rainbow's sister novel, Women in Love, as the war haunts Lawrence. Likewise, Mark Gertler's painting The Merry-Go-Round is to Lawrence a powerful and obsessive image of the mechanical corruption of the human spirit, and enters Women in Love as the model for the sculpture that the futurist Lurker designs to adorn a factory. For an audience of Lawrence's time, these images would have signaled the war as the real subject of a seemingly historically unfixed novel. But the uncompromising and hopeless view of European culture and social relations in Women in Love is unpublishable during the war. This atomized and deracinated predicament, presented in the novel as tragedy, is all too easily assumed or even affirmed in readings of the text and of Lawrence himself.
I've been puzzled for years why people see Women in Love as the achievement of a new state of consciousness from which people can learn and go on. I think that precisely it is the laying bare of almost impossible contradictions, which incidentally changed the whole form of his fiction, and it's a fiction that is reduced to a single generation and to almost schematic relationships and oppositions. When I hear people talk about this as the witness for humanity, or the achievement of an aesthetic position which is above the relative crudeness, you know, or what is described as the simple naturalism of the early tales. You know, that's a very common way of putting it. I simply do not know what they're talking about. I mean, absolutely uncomprehending. And when you're in that state of mind, it must mean that you're not failing to understand individuals. You're up against a culture. You're up against a bloc. It's only a very temporary crystallization from this much wider and more active living social historical situation. It is simply that when people, and the crystallization is an interesting and impressive process, but when people use it to put down things like Sons and Lovers and the early stories, which they see as still cluttered with the detail of a real place and a working life and family and so on. One knows they are using that novel in a quite opposite direction, not as crystallization, but as a cancellation of that kind of involvement. And then I think, as a matter of fact, they're not even reading Women in Love very deeply. Because if people pick up Lawrence as this vagrant, and as so often read the struggle through the point at which it's presumed to have reached, not actually ever did reach in Lawrence, but in the sort of a kind of false canonization of a version of Lawrence which got around. Then you read back through this and you get the sense of a man who is not only moving away, for which there are very strong social, cultural reasons, from the working environment in which he was raised, but in this version he is seen as raising himself above considerations and concerns like that, whereas whole importance of Lawrence is how close he is to that, and actually how close he remains to it even on the travels. I mean, you know, this involvement. Not when he's going off into the great abstractions of nature or time or society or what may be, but in that kind of detailed material involvement, he carried through something which was distinctively a part of his own common culture. I mean, that there is a physicality, there is a proper attention to the material. There is no sense of the material needing to be displaced to servants or to the margins of life or to the inconveniences of life. This is life, this handling material. Now, if all that is suppressed in the later account or seen simply as his idiosyncrasy, and the early involvement which was direct in his own place seen as something which, of course, as a real artist he had to get away from, then we've missed everything that's important about Lawrence. There is no connection. It's significant that that version of him should have been so widely propagated, especially since his time, more and more people have gone through versions of the Lawrence social experience.
In the years subsequent to the war, the staple image which determines our responses to Lawrence is that of the romantic wanderer, hostile to all existing conceptions of community. But this image diverts us from other factors in his self-imposed exile: the hostility of the publishing establishment, censorship, the loss of an audience. As he travels the world, the formative crisis of the war pervades his writing.
In 1915, the old world ended. The integrity of London collapsed, and the genuine debasement began. The unspeakable baseness of the press and the public voice, the reign of that bloated ignominy, John Bull. No man who has really, consciously lived through this can believe again, absolutely, in democracy. We hear so much of the bravery and horrors at the front. Brave the men were, all honour to them. It was at home the world was lost. We hear too little of the collapse of the proud human spirit at home, the triumph of sordid, rampant, raging meanness.
The discontinuity in the normal tenor of English life seems to have been remarkable. It's certainly something that he closely describes, and on this I think you always have to allow with Lawrence for his own highly individual reading of some situation, but I think on this he's entirely central. Something did break in those years of the war, when all sorts of traps are sprung, that the rather innocent songs about empire and nation and king and so on, which children have sung at school, I mean, as just sets of words, you know, are suddenly activated by politicians and generals, and people march away to be killed, but this happens frequently in that stage of war, that in a sense what comes to the surface is a kind of ugly rejoicing in what is eventually seen as disastrous, and this split particularly between the people who were merely activating those images and the people who, of course, getting involved in the fighting, who quite quickly had the images blown to pieces and tried to tell people what it was really like, and were not believed because fed back at them was this same stuff. Now, what Lawrence hit most was this stuff at home, which was lies and every kind of false glorification. And in that moment, I mean, it had extraordinary effects on his development. He said, well, people have got no sense. People can't be trusted. People have got no judgment. which is a fair thing to say when you're opposing the judgments people are making, but immediately with Lawrence it becomes an absolute statement about people for all time and a reason against democracy and so on, which would be nonsense. But he picked up the ugliness, and there were 2 months of the Falklands War in which many people felt like Lawrence feeling about that, not just what was happening in the fighting, but this extraordinary ugly exaltation which passes, but while it's happening, it's profoundly disturbing. And he's trying to get at the sense of what it could be, and if there is any alternative to it. Hence these attempts to link up with this or that group, which is, however, still living in that pre-war world in which a few minor institutional reforms or changes of attitude would meet a crisis of this scale. I think Lawrence, he doesn't find solutions, and he has some very bad moments in which he seems almost to surrender to the horror of it. On the other hand, he's treating it as the kind of crisis it is, which is life or death. I mean, it's not a minor improvement or anything of that kind by that stage. And the fact that this was then to some extent reconstituted after the war ended, I mean, we can now see that that crisis has been continuous from that time to this, even although there have been intervals of peace, and that it is the kind of crisis which came again when people really understood what nuclear weapons were or something. It's that sort of scale. And then it's not surprising that it is at once very intense, very large, but also there are no available organizations which are quite responding in his time to that kind of crisis.
As much as any writer of his age, Lawrence wrote for the future, with the energies of his work thrown forward to the unrealized possibilities, the horizon of transformation. We can only read him from the present, however, not as a memory or as a recovery of a lost essence, but within our own horizon of present and future possibilities. We use images to suggest what Lawrence's absent audience might have seen in, for example, his portrayal of the industrial machine. Historically, in Women in Love, it represents the war and the industrial capitalism that produced the war. But it is not an image of the war or of capitalism. Images have no reality or history in themselves. They have value only within the framework we give them. That is why it is so difficult and so necessary to argue with them. Are these images helpful or dangerous, positive or negative, oppressive or liberating? Only in the use we make of them, only in the present, can they have a function. Our understanding of Lawrence's identity is determined by the cultural institutions that circulate and reproduce his work. In an age of mechanical reproduction and electronic communication, the unceasing supply of images of art and the artist tends to encourage the isolation of artistic production from its social origin. This situation suggests another meaning for Lawrence's image of the machine endlessly reproducing its own order through a process of incorporation. In the case of a writer like Lawrence, the temptation to mythologize artistic opposition to industry and culture is great. But it is ironic that in so doing we deny his writing its power to dramatize and diagnose the industrial base of culture from an inside position. We cannot reduce his complex and ambivalent responses to a series of simple-minded oppositions, nature versus culture, organic versus mechanical, individual transcendence versus social history. If we do so, we effect a secondary estrangement of Lawrence, denying him an audience in our time as he was denied in his own.
The fact that very powerful images can be imposed, and that Lawrence in particular has been constructed in so many images which are endlessly reproduced, Well, it's bound to make one wary of using images to represent him at all. But what's interested me is the sense of replacing this image of Lawrence in what is, after all, undeniably, unarguably his world, the world in which his perceptions were formed, in which he was raised, and where it is no case of simply replacing him in that, because that would be to cancel the whole development, but to see him in that perspective, this is right. And I do believe that if you have a culture as soaked with images as this, you're going to be so surrounded by misrepresentations and simplifications that you can get the recoil from the medium, so to say, which some people have, as if it had never happened in every medium, you know, but because it's a widely dispersed medium, people see it and they see so much misrepresentation and image simplification that the only answer to them is other representations, and the representation which is after all not simply interpretation, but is unarguably there, as this was Lawrence's world, and that world is continuous, and just as the reading of Lawrence has been continuous, so the mining of the coal and the conflicts that he saw as a child and saw all their consequences working through, those are contemporary and continuous too. That both can be read alongside each other as continuing connecting processes, and if it's the image of that, then it's the right image, I think.
We must enter into the historical currents of Lawrence's age and see the correlation of his personal history to a broader movement. We must confront and re-enter the debate as he re-entered it on his last visit to England in 1926. May 1926. Under pressure from coal owners, miners call a strike. The general strike ensues, but collapses after 9 days. The miners hold out, their funds exhausted. In August, the Baldwin government colludes with coal owners to smash the miners, and police are dispatched to the coalfields. In September, Lawrence returns to his native district and witnesses the strike. Deprivation among mining families is severe. As during the First World War, Lawrence sees class warfare as imminent. But now, the perception is widely shared. The experience revives a mixture of sympathy and antagonism for his community. The temporary balance of power in labor relations which existed in his youth disposes him to see class war as a threat to the fabric of English life. Despite this, he sees mining families not as enemies within the state, but rather as exiles within it. He attempts to align his own experience with theirs. He is eager to articulate and reaffirm his ties. The tension of his own exile, however, leads him to respond to the current crisis through memory. His confused awareness that he is failing to connect with the present through the interference of an idealization of his personal past is evident in the essay Return to Bestwood.
I feel more alien, perhaps, in my home place than anywhere else in the world. The country seems, somehow, fogged over with people, and yet not really touched. And yet the fields and the woods, in between the roads and paths, sleep as in a heavy, weary dream, disconnected from the modern world. But the special depression, this time, is the great coal strike. It is another world. There are policemen everywhere, great, big, strange policemen, with faces like a leg of mutton. And this, in my native place, truly, One no longer knows the palm of his own hand.
It's a very difficult thing in the whole of the thought of the last 200 years to separate the idealizations of some earlier period from their recurrent use as radical images of the future or of the possibilities of the future. I mean, there are times when you simply have to reject them because they're being projected as something which has been irretrievably lost since people were educated or since people had the vote or something like that. You know, there's that use of the old happier state which must not be tolerated for a moment because it's always invoked, really, to stop some of the best things that have since happened. On the other hand, from Cobbett through, even when you can know in narrow factual terms that they're wrong about the world they're writing, remembering, recalling, it seems to be a major resource in projecting the possibility of the future, as if saying at least the past was different, which means the present is not unalterable. It's that kind of argument. And at times Lawrence is doing that. And this curious way in which a version of the past becomes a future is one of the hardest things to understand, because once you state it too simply, you're into other uses which sound the same, which are nothing like, which are not defensible at all. When they're used to cancel out everything that people do. And Lawrence does this when he talks about industry as such, you know, rather than talking about very specific organization of industry which did certain things to certain people.
As an immediate response to social crisis, Return to Bestwood displays Lawrence's own ambivalences. A contemporary event produces an effort to fuse an idealized popular memory of the past with a turbulent present. Lawrence invokes past assurances which are ultimately illusory. But this duality of response is not unique to Lawrence's sensibility, and it confronts us as we attempt to allot him a place in the history of our time.
But the women seem to have changed most in this, for they have no respect for anything. There was a scene in the marketplace yesterday, a Mrs. Houghton and a Mrs. Rowley being taken off to court to be tried for insulting and obstructing the police. The police had been escorting the blacklegs from the mines after a so-called day's work, and the women had made the usual row. They were two women from decent homes. In the past, they would have died of shame at having to go to court. But now, not at all.
As a full-scale response to the general strike, Lady Chatterley's Lover, his last novel, prefers the assurances of memory, myth, and relatively obvious oppositions over an uncertain historical reality. In all of its three versions, the novel presents a more conventional solution to social crisis than elsewhere in Lawrence's work. But in reading it, we must remember its place in history, in the history of its writer, the history of its time. Its processes of simplification are not a dead end. The novel is part of a more powerfully developed vision evident across the range of his writings. Although more easily interpreted in terms of social history, Lawrence's novels are not the only testimony of his commitment to the problems of community and individual under an industrial state.
The industrial problem arises from the base forcing of all human energy into a competition of mere acquisition.
I think that in many ways people were waiting for kinds of work, which Lawrence is one of the early examples, which really do try to recreate a totality and a communality of experience. Above all, in the kinds of colloquial terms that Lawrence could use. I think this is so important, that in the writing all through, in the narrative and so on, it's different in the essays, but in the stories, he adapts English prose to the rhythms of speech and a lot of the vocabulary of speech in a remarkable way, which really is a big cultural shift. And it's always the sign when he's getting beyond his resources and beyond anything he can understand, when he has to take up again this language which everybody instantly identifies as Laurentian, certain of the jargon words, which are always a sign that he can't find everyday language for them. What is remarkable is how much everyday and colloquial language he found for quite complicated ideas and descriptions and relationships, and he found those rhythms and communicated them. And I suppose that is what one means by a common culture, and the possibility of using a medium as a common culture, that people can find connecting words and rhythms which don't sacrifice the complexity and intensity of life, which people know is there, and they don't want it made difficult, but they don't want it simplified either. I think in that sense, the best uses of the modern media have been foreshadowed in artists who came rather before them, who were looking for that kind of use. I think this is so in Lawrence's case anyway.
What is man without an income? What is man without an income? Well, let him get on the dole. Dole? 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 Hole? 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 Soul? 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 What is man without an income? Answer, without a rigmarole. On the dole, 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 he's a hole, hole, hole in the nation's pocket. Now then, you leave a man's misfortunes alone. He's got a soul, 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 but the coal, 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 on the whole, 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 doesn't pay. So the dole, dole, dole's the only way. And on the dole, 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 a man's a hole, 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 in the nation's pocket. And his soul, 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 won't stop a hole, 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 though his ashes might. Immortal Caesar, dead and turned to clay, would stop a hole to keep the wind away. But a man without a job isn't even as good as a gob of clay. Body and soul, he's just a hole, down which the nation's resources roll away.